I want to state up front that I did not include Dave Filoni or Pablo Hidalgo quotes, as I know EU purists seem to have issues with the reliability, quote-unquote, of those sources. So I just made it easier for all of us and left them out of this section. The first one might be a bit of a cheap shot, but I'm bringing it up anyway. This and all other products that take place after the events depicted in Return of the Jedi are the author's vision of what may have happened. The true fate of the heroes and villains of the Star Wars universe remains the exclusive province of George Lucas and Lucasfilm Limited. It says this and all other products after Return of the Jedi, so it's clearly referring to other EU material, but its source is a source book which has connections to a role-playing game, so I'm not quite sure where it fits in, if it's just talking about the source book or the EU material in general, but it's absolutely worth bringing up. The next is a quote from Kevin J. Anderson, an EU author. When you read Dark Empire or any of the other novels, remember that although Lucasfilm has approved them, these are our sequels, not George Lucas's. If Lucasfilm ever makes films that take place after Return of the Jedi, they will be George Lucas's own creations, probably with no connection to anything we have written. But in the meantime, enjoy these graphic stories. Read the novels of Timothy Zahn, Canon Tiers, Kenneth Flint, Dave Wolverton, and myself. This shows that the authors knew it wasn't authentic to George's vision, and they expected to be retconned in the events of a sequel trilogy. Why would they think this is it if it was all canon to George? The next is from Alan Kosh, I hope I'm saying that correctly, an editor at Lucasfilm, and Sue Rostoni, an executive editor who was heavily involved in the EU. She'll come up a lot over the next few minutes. Gospel, or canon as we refer to it, includes the screenplays, the films, and the radio dramas and novelizations. These works spin out of George Lucas's original stories. The rest are written by other writers. However, between us, we've read everything, and much of it is taken into account in the overall continuity. The entire catalog of published works comprises a vast history with many offshoots, variations, and tangents, like any other well-developed mythology. Here, they clearly separate George's stuff from the EU, but they say the EU does factor into the continuity for stories, which is what the parameters of the EU were dependent on. Dave Wolverton, author of Courtship of Princess Leia, said this in 1994. In my mind, Luke is sort of a priest character. For me, being a Mormon, I want to see a priest character married, but George Lucas, being a Catholic, wants to keep him single. Perhaps this doesn't necessarily fit here in this section, but I thought it was interesting as the authors had been planning all along to hitch Mara and Luke, but George clearly didn't like this idea, which we'll discuss more later. Andy Mangels, an EU author, had this to say. Once I heard that George Lucas was asked to comment on the many interpretations of Star Wars in book, comic, record, radio, and TV spin-offs that grew from his original creation. The films are gospel, he said. All the rest are gossip. I like that. Sounds like a typical George Lucas quote. While it technically is a third-hand account, still worth bringing up as it shows he didn't count the EU as legitimate, and this is coming from an EU author. Steve Sansweet, EU author and head of fan relations for a time, said this in 1998. Which brings us to the oft-asked question, just what is Star Wars canon and what is not? The one sure answer, the Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition. The three films themselves as executive produced, and in the case of Star Wars, written and directed by George Lucas, are canon. Coming in a close second, we have the authorized adaptations of the three films, the novels, radio dramas, and comics. After that, almost everything falls into a category of quasi-canon. The definition of quasi-canon is apparently, but not really. Again, a distinction between George's stuff and the EU. Pete James, an editor at Dark Horse, said this. When asked about the possible EU retcons with the prequel trilogy, and pointed out some minor issues with the EU and the special editions, a Dark Horse editor said this. It's not something we can really worry about, so we don't. Lots of people have been working on lots of Star Wars extrapolations for the last 20 years, in good faith. There were never any promises from George Lucas or Lucasfilm regarding the acceptance of their work into some wider canon. The examples you cite above then become merely shots across the bow, a warning that perhaps some folks are taking this far too seriously and may have forgotten that fun and excitement was what fueled the Star Wars phenomenon in the first place. Interesting. Fun and excitement was more important than taking the continuity seriously. Kind of reminds me of a certain Dave Filoni quote the EU purists like to hop on.
People get into all these debates of what's canon, what's not, and sometimes forget just the special nature of telling a good story and creating great characters.
Timothy Zahn writer of the Thrawn trilogy, said in 2000, "We were allowed to play in George Lucas's driveway. If and when George backs his truck out and runs over our stuff, we have no cause to complain. A lot of my stuff was close enough to the edge. Seems like Tim knew George could retcon them at any minute and that it wasn't all the same. The use of it and when implies they expected it to happen." Steve Sansweet said in 2000, "As many fans know, when it comes to Star Wars knowledge, there are degrees of canon. The only true canon are the films themselves. For years, Lucas Books has stayed clear of characters, events, or the time frame that George might want to deal with in the Star Wars prequels. While such things as the Clone Wars, the Fall of the Jedi, and Palpatine's rise to power were on that list, Boba Fett wasn't considered to be of major concern. Sounds like the only true canon was the films because that's all George counted. Kind of reminds me of the Star Trek situation." Steve also says in 2001, "Terms like canon and continuity tend to get thrown around casually, which doesn't help at all. When it comes to absolute canon, the real story of Star Wars, you must turn to the films themselves, and only the films. Even novelizations are interpretations of the film, and while they are largely true to George Lucas's vision, he works quite closely with the novel authors. The method in which they are written does allow for some minor differences. The novelizations are written concurrently with the film's production, so variations in detail do creep in from time to time. Nonetheless, they should be regarded as very accurate depictions of the fictional Star Wars movies. So the real story of Star Wars is only the films and not the EU. Interesting." A word from Insider 57 says the same thing. "With that said, there is a discrepancy between Return of the Jedi novelization and the one true, absolutely, and only canonical Star Wars source, the movies." Sue Rostoni, however, hit the hammer on the nose in Star Wars Gamer number 6 in 2001. "Remember this, if nothing else, because this will explain everything, as I've already alluded to, and we'll keep harping on this throughout the video. Canon refers to an authoritative list of books that the Lucas licensing editors consider an authentic part of the official Star Wars history. Our goal is to present a continuous and unified history of the Star Wars galaxy, insofar as that history does not conflict with or undermine the meaning of Mr. Lucas's Star Wars saga of films and screenplays. Things that Lucas licensing does not consider official parts of the continuous Star Wars history show in Infinity's logo or are contained in Star Wars tales. Everything else is considered canon." Whenever the EU or Lucasfilm people talk about something being canon, it's a licensing thing. Canon refers to licensing, not what George Lucas personally counts. Just because the EU was canon prior to 2014 for the company, it doesn't mean Lucas held it as canon. Canon is a licensing term. I've seen some suggest that because Lucas owned Lucasfilm and Lucas Licensing was a division of his company, that the distinction really isn't warranted. I assure you, it is. I'll reference the concept a lot throughout the video, but when I get to addressing the George Lucas quotes that seem to favor the EU later in the video, I'll dive in full to why the licensing continuity is a separate thing from Lucas continuity, even if Lucas owns the company. Moving on, an insider quote from 2002 stated, referring to Sue Rostoni and Lucy Wilson, the two of them decided that to maintain quality, it would be crucial to monitor the storylines of all projects and ensure that none of their books contradicted one another. So this idea of having a continuity and all that was from Lucasfilm officials, not Lucas himself. Chris Sarasi, a Lucasfilm books editor, said the analogy is that every piece of published Star Wars fiction is a window into the real Star Wars universe. Some windows are a bit foggier than others. Some are decidedly abstract, but each contains a nugget of truth to them. Like the great Jedi Knight Obi-Wan Kenobi said, many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. This again shows the EU isn't authentic to the Lucas stuff, but something separate. I do want to note that this is a quote that I don't have a source for, but I included it because other Lucasfilm associates have used it and treated it as authentic. I just couldn't find where it originally came from, so it might have been a verbal quote later put in writing by someone else. From Leland Shee. Ah, yes, Leland Shee. A favorite amongst the purists. Let's see what he had to say. We're going to talk about him a lot throughout this video. In 2003, he again differentiated between the canons and referred back to the idea that canon was a licensing thing. Lucasfilm canon refers to anything produced by any of the Lucas companies, whether it be the movies, books, games, or internet. Movie canon is only that which you see and hear in the Star Wars films. Sue Rostoni had I hope I'm saying her name right. Sue Rostoni had a couple of quotes that she gave on a StarWars.com forum post in 2003. One saying, "George doesn't give us much information about his future movies until he's making them. In general, George does not take the EU into account when he's making his movies." Another, "It's our job to manipulate the EU into fitting George's future movies, which often contradicts stuff we've done." Here she acknowledges George doesn't really care about the EU and factoring it into his films, and the movies do contradict the EU. Keep in mind this is 2003, after the first two prequel trilogy films, and after the special edition updates. But they have to make it fit all anyway. This is very telling. Ryan Church, a concept design artist for Lucasfilm for the films, weighed in as well. When asked if concept art designers referred to the books, guides, or EU in general, he had this to say. "As designers, we look at all kinds of stuff for inspiration, and we have a crack research staff to help us with that. The Star Wars books serve as a starting point and guide for certain types of questions that arise in respect to certain cultures or technologies that have already been established in the movies. The Star Wars Chronicles book is our Bible. The incredible cross-section books provide a great starting point when we're adding to existing locations. We usually don't refer to the expanded universe material specifically unless our research team finds something that directly corresponds to our assignment. For Episode 3, we're going to a lot of new places, and George Lucas has really pushed us to come up with new looks or vehicles, environments, cultures, and characters. But when we receive an assignment that deals with an aspect of the Star Wars universe that hasn't been nailed down in the movies, George likes us to keep a completely open mind and leave behind our preconceived notions or expectations for that culture or character. That freedom, coupled with the fact that we are such fans of the movies, can lead to some very interesting solutions. The biggest single source of inspiration, though, are the movies themselves. We designed for that medium for how things will look up on the screen as part of the story." He clearly states that not only do they not usually refer to the EU unless they need to, but George expects them to leave behind preconceived notions from the EU when addressing something that hasn't been brought up in the movies. If anyone tries to say this is simply a reference to when doing something new never done before in the movies, that wouldn't make sense, because if it was brand new to the Star Wars universe period, it wouldn't have preconceived notions. It's clearly a reference to George saying, have an open mind and don't worry about the EU. Which is interesting, because I feel like that's what TCW crew members would say George's mentality was. Yet purists will ignore that, and yet here it is coming from someone who worked on the films. The following exchange between Sue Rostoni and a commenter online is very interesting. On a StarWars.com forum post, Sue was asked, "I've noted an evolution of your use of the term canon over the years. In 1994's Insider number 23, you referred to the canon gospel as most people do now. Movies, novelizations, etc., and unemployed the term continuity to refer to the EU continuity you and Miss Wilson had decided upon previously. That same year, in a Del Rey interview, you described an in-house Bible of the EU timeline maintained by Lucas Licensing. By 1996, as seen in the preface to Secrets of the Shadows of the Empire, you were referring to the Bible as the canon, and ascribing it to Lucasfilm. I presume this meant licensing. Skipping to 2001's Gamer number 6, you were using the term canon to refer to the list of EU books that Lucas Licensing considered factual parts of Star Wars, and of course back in May you identified the ICS as canon because it didn't have an Infinities logo, which suggests that all non-Infinites EU material is canon. Mr. Chi was kind enough to point out a difference between movie canon and what he called Lucasfilm canon, which again I presume means Lucas Licensing and which would include the ICS. I'm curious to know though, how you decided to make use of the term canon to refer to the EU instead of the more common terms like continuity, official continuity, EU continuity, and so on. Thanks in advance for your answer. She responded with only continuity versus canon. It's pretty much the same thing. Sounds better to say that we try to maintain the continuity of the universe rather than saying the canon of the universe. Notice how she doesn't take the time to correct the commenter about the separation between films and the EU that was made. If they were together, would Sue not have reinforced that like Chi would sometimes do in the years later, which we'll talk about in a bit? Sue also said in 2004, referring to George, he doesn't see the extended universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. I think this has been mentioned previously, maybe in other places, but it's not new info as far as I remember. Not only is she saying Lucas sees the EU as their Star Wars but not his, but she says this shouldn't be new information, like it's been the case all along, as we've shown something that George and other EU authors have said over the last several years. The next one is a quote from Pablo Hidalgo. I know I said I wouldn't bring him up, but this is a pre-Disney acquisition quote, so I don't see why this particular one would be an issue, especially since EU purists use his quotes that apply to the 90s era EU. He stated, fans often wonder if Dark Empire or the Thrawn trilogy were based off of Lucas's early notes for a sequel trilogy or are meant to be episodes 7, 8, and 9. That's not the case. Those works are the creation of their respective authors with the guidance of editors at Lucas Licensing. They are not, nor ever were, meant to be George Lucas's definitive vision of what happens next. Even if someone thinks he's simply saying George Lucas's sequel trilogy would have been a different story set after these events, Pablo is clearly stating George doesn't think the Thrawn trilogy is a part of the future after Jedi. George would believe that if he counted it as canon, but apparently he does not. Brett Retko, a Lucasfilm editor, said when asked about Mara Jade popping up in the Return of the Jedi radio drama, Mara Jade is an outstanding character, and we here at Insider thank Timothy Zahn every day for creating her. However, stories from the Expanded Universe books are not part of the canon of the films, and therefore it is doubtful she'll make an appearance. Why state this if it was all the same story? Mara should be part of the canon of the films if the EU is part of George's vision for the story. But she's not, because they are indeed separate, and she is an EU canon character. Leland also weighed in and said, the hologram's primary purpose is to keep track of Star Wars continuity for Lucas Licensing and to some degree Lucas Online. To my knowledge, it is only rarely used for production purposes. Anybody can have their own perception of what is and isn't canon. The holocron comes into play for anything official being developed for books, games, websites, and merchandise. For anything beyond that, it is simply a reference tool. If the continuity was all the same, this would be a helpful tool, would it not? Unless it's because by this point in 2005, George is only concerned with his canon, the films he's personally worked on, and nothing else mattered to him. And interesting that he says anyone can have their own perception of canon. I thought there was only one canon? That's what he'd go on to say a few years later. Gary Kurtz, producer on A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, stated, Lucas did give permission to have fiction books written about the era after Episode 6. Those books revolve around, for example, the twin children of Han and Leia, the rebuilding of the Jedi Order, and a new threat from outside the galaxy. They are bland decoctions that are, at best, just a repetition of elements from the film trilogy. The chances seem non-existent that Lucas will ever make a film from them. To be fair, I'm not sure how involved he was with the brand by this point, but interesting he thinks George wouldn't make a film based off of the EU. He would only think that if he thought that George didn't count them as canon. In a forum, Sue was asked about the Starlog quote by a fan. With the issue of Starlog magazine and with the War of the Worlds cover is an interview article with George Lucas. He stated something which he had said before, which is that he doesn't follow the Star Wars EU. He doesn't read the books or comics. He also said that when they started doing all this, which is allowing other storytellers to tell their own Star Wars tales, he decreed that the Star Wars universe would be split into two, just like Star Trek. I don't know nuts about Star Trek, so don't ask me about that. One would be his own universe, the 6-episode movie saga. The other would be a whole other universe, the expanded universe. He continued to say that the EU tries as much as possible to tie into his own universe, but sometimes they move into a whole other line of their own. Instead of debunking this, she responded only with this. Yeah, this is pretty much what I've heard, except that people have said he reads the comics. If the EU was canon to George, why not debunk this right off the bat? If the Starlog quote really meant something else, like the purists keep insisting, like Leland Tree tried to do damage control with by explaining away later on, why would Sue Rostoni, a higher-up in the EU management, not share this? She was one of the higher-ups regarding licensing in the EU after all. It doesn't make any sense unless, hear me out, George doesn't count the EU as his own personal canon, and she knows that. A lot of these quotes seem to keep saying the same thing. Is anyone else bored yet? I kind of am. Sue also said in 2005, "The books follow the continuity of the films as best we can, taking into account that George follows his own continuity, and rightly so. He's the filmmaker. As far as the legitimate continuation of the films, if George had continued making Star Wars films past Return of the Jedi, I don't think they would have reflected what the Star Wars authors have written. The books, comics, etc. are a legitimate continuation of the Star Wars saga as we define it. I'm not certain of the context of your question. Somehow I feel like I'm walking into something here." I'm sorry, but this one's a gotcha. There's no way around it. She not only states that the films are a different continuity, which she's previously said is the same canon in her eyes, from the EU, and she cast doubt on the books as being valid to George, saying he would have done something else. She said that the EU is only a legitimate continuation as Lucas licensing defines it, not George. We could almost call it a case closed right here. But by all means, why stop the fun? There's so much more to discuss. Now let's get back to Leland. When asked, and what goes in the blank timeline spaces of film-only universe, can we never know the history or background of that Star Wars universe like we can in the EU Star Wars universe? He replied, nothing. That's why it's film-only. Perhaps not as much of a slam dunk here as the last couple, but still interesting that when asked if we can know the blank spots in the film universe like the EU, he simply says no, as opposed to saying, well, actually they're the same universe, or the EU is the blank spaces. Very interesting. Leland also opened up about George's disregard of the publishing world in Insider 96, referring to when George went on Conan and gave Motti the first name of Conan Antonio Motti, stating, but that's just part of the story. Turns out that Michael Reeves and Steve Perry actually had intended to give Motti the first name Z in the upcoming Death Star novel. Z was approved and ready to go when George surprised the world with a name of his own devising. Luckily, we were able to change the name before it went to print. If this was a film character, wouldn't this have been ran by George? And he did his own thing anyway? Interesting. Daniel Wallace, an EU author, states in 2008, the concept of an expanding universe certainly isn't unique to Star Wars. Many popular genre properties, from Star Trek to Alien, release spin-off tales that shed lights on events not seen in the official narrative. But the Star Wars EU is unique in both its size and in the care with which its narrative is shepherded and organized. In Star Wars, the expanding universe is official, albeit on a slightly lower level, sometimes called C-canon, C-box on page 40, than the absolute authority of these 6 Star Wars films. If they were all part of the same story, then it should be the same canon. The fact that it's lower and the films are the absolute source, interesting. It's making a distinction there. Henry Gilroy, a writer on early episodes of TCW, stated, George envisioned something different than what was created for the EU, and Dave and I jumped at the chance to explore that. I believe this is in reference to General Grievous's backstory. Another Pablo Hidalgo quote, this one from 2010, reads, I see the Clone Wars as being no different than the arrival of the prequels in 1999. We fans knew that those movies would be a representation of the true Star Wars universe as imagined by George Lucas, and in some cases it would not perfectly match the stories told by the expanded universe authors. I think with each episode, we start to get a much better understanding about what the real Star Wars universe is like, and it won't be until whenever the series ends that we'll be able to accurately decide how the older EU material fits into the big picture. A lot to unpack here. Not only is he comparing TCW to the retcons from the prequel trilogy in the EU, something we'll discuss more later, but he calls TCW a representation of Star Wars by George and calls that the real Star Wars universe. He also says they'll figure out the retcons later, something I believe I've also seen Leland Shee state, but I'm guessing with the canon reset colliding with the show's cancellation, they just never got around to it per higher-up orders. In 2011, Leland Shee says, oh boy, this is a fun one. He says G-canon and T-canon comprise George Lucas's vision of the Star Wars universe. C-canon and S-canon comprise the vision of the Star Wars universe held by Lucas licensing that goes beyond George Lucas's vision. This material is collectively referred to as the expanded universe. Again, for all the times purists want to run and cry to a quote or two of Leland's defending their position, both of which, again, we'll discuss later, he seems to be doing a disservice right now by clearly stating T-canon is George's vision, meaning TCW, and the EU is not his vision, but merely the vision by Lucas licensing. And our last Pablo Hidalgo quote prior to the acquisition, trust me, I checked, he says, Lucas allows for an expanded universe that exists parallel to the one he directly oversees. Though these stories may get his stamp of approval, they don't enter his canon unless they are depicted cinematically in one of his projects. There you go. Remember this one too. Just because it gets a stamp of approval, it doesn't mean it enters his canon unless it is cinematically depicted in one of his projects, like Quinlan Vos or other EU elements he quote-unquote referenced in the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars. I'm sorry guys, but this seems to be a pretty closed case. Let's go back to Leland Shee. Some people bring up he's the one kind of running continuity around this time, as it is before the story group under Disney, but he says Star Wars continuity, even EU continuity, does not rest on my shoulders. Understand that the Holocron's primary purpose is to keep track of Star Wars continuity for Lucas licensing. He clearly refers to the Lucas licensing and EU continuity as being distinct things on their own. Otherwise, he would have left it at continuity. Timothy Zahn said in 2016, "We just don't have the EU as official canon, except it never really was official, in the sense that it was set in stone. It was always something Lucas could override at any time, and in fact, everybody who had written stuff about Boba Fett watched that backstory get demolished in the prequel trilogy." Some people might take note of the date and remember he was writing Disney canon books at this time and think this is some sort of influence from the mouse weighing in. But that's not true, because as we've already discussed and shown, he's made similar sounding statements in years prior at the height of the 90s era EU. Tom Veitch, Dark Empire and Tales of the Jedi creator, and trust me, we'll get to Dark Empire later, said, "I think George has always felt that the comics were an alternate Star Wars universe from the films. I don't think he ever saw the comics as canon, although he did use them as a resource for ideas and images." Again, keep this in mind for when we get to the prequels and the alleged references. Also, Disney's not swaying on him either, because Tom hasn't done any Star Wars work since the 90s. Now, let's get to the big one. Howard Rothman, again, the president of Lucas Licensing. After his retirement, so no financial incentive from the mouse, he said, "When I began the publishing program, it was a sacrosanct rule that everything had to relate to each other. Everything had to be consistent with each other, and of course the movies which were canon, and that was different from the way that Star Trek had done things, and we were pretty religious about doing that. Our biggest problem was a guy named George Lucas, because he didn't necessarily buy into, the spin-off fiction and the game program and all the alternate universe we were creating. We wanted it to be one universe. We felt really strongly that that's what is needed to be. But George, as the filmmaker, didn't want to be beholden to somebody else's creative vision. So we would have interesting skirmishes because we had a bunch of stuff that became, for the fans, pretty much canon about what happened after Return of the Jedi, what different places in the galaxy were called, and lots of different things. And if he was proposing to do something in the prequels that contradicted that, we would have long debates, which usually ended at least after the first section with, "I don't care, this is what I'm doing," and maybe after the fourth or fifth session sometimes, "Alright, maybe we could change it this way." This one says a lot. Obviously, he's telling the truth, as he refers to the Star Trek thing, which George had brought up in the 2000s. It's interesting to note that initially George was hesitant to the idea of publishing, and he only agreed because Howard told him it would be a separate continuity. He literally says they had problems because they had stories that fans thought were canon, but Lucas didn't agree and was wanting to ignore that. And even after it was brought to his attention, George was like, "Nah," only sometimes being willing to keep continuity with the EU after debating it 4 or 5 times. Sometimes implying there were times Howard lost to the master. So for anyone thinking George was 100% willing to keep the EU consistent, well, Howard, the so-called son in the Holy Star Wars Trinity, says otherwise. But George thought it was all canon, right? Well, I'm sorry. I hate to break it to you, but if it was canon to George, he wouldn't have fought Howard on it, and he wouldn't have only agreed to it if it was kept separate from his continuity. Leland Shee also reflected on George in 2018, saying, "What George did with the films and the Clone Wars was pretty much his universe. He didn't really have that much concern for what we were doing in the books and the games. So the expanding universe was very much separate. What we had to do in the expanding universe was, if George did something in the films that contradicted something we had done in the EU, then we'd have to change the EU to match what he did in the films." Leland makes it clear that not only was TCW coming from George, but that he didn't really care about what was going on in the EU. Some may think this was Disney swaying over Chi, who is still employed with them, but I disagree because it only echoes what others have stated over the prior 2 decades. Canon Tiers, an EU author, stated in 2018, "Those of us writing the EU were always told all along, from the very beginning, have I not stressed that strongly enough? Only the movies are canon. Sure, it was disappointing. Seems like she got the memo. George didn't count the EU. It was canon to licensing only." Good old Leland also popped back up saying, "I did not have direct contact with George Lucas about Star Wars continuity. Dave Filoni, who worked on Clone Wars, definitely did. So for me, the spirit of George's work is what's in the films, and it doesn't go too far beyond that. Again, George wasn't connected to the EU. He also said in 2018, Lucas canon, and when I say canon, I'm talking about what he was doing in the films and what he was doing in the Clone Wars, was hugely important. What we were doing in the books wasn't really on his radar. Again, TCW was George's stuff, but not the books. It wasn't too important to him and not on his radar. J.W. Rinzler, someone who worked for Lucas for a while and wrote several biographies, stated in 2019, George had a very healthy attitude towards the EU and licensing in general. I mean, licensing starting after episode 1 just became this juggernaut that was making just truckloads and truckloads of money for Lucasfilm. So, you don't bother licensing. And he had good lieutenants running licensing. And they would just ask him, if something in particular maybe George might care about, and basically George would give everyone a full head of steam. His attitude was, do what you want, don't talk about Yoda, or for this movie I'm going to be doing that, so don't talk about that. And that was it. You did your thing and he did his thing. And then if it contradicted the EU, Leland would get together with publishing and say, how can we fix this? And come up with some retro reverse engineered fit. I mean, it was make-believe. It is make-believe. So people didn't get very uptight about it. And George also used ideas from the expanding universe. He was interested in it, but it wasn't the movies. There was the movies and there was everything else. Or there was the Clone Wars TV show and there was everything else. There was what he was doing and everything else. But he took stuff from what other people were doing all the time. It was his intellectual property, and he would take stuff or change it or expand upon on it. It was a very healthy system. He was very democratic. And, he didn't like Mara Jade, but he didn't come to the licensing and say, you have to kill her off. He just said, I'm not happy about it. But he didn't, he had bigger fish to fry. Looks like, as JW said, TCW and the movies were George's, the books were just a separate thing. He weighed in on it from sometimes because he could, but for the most part it wasn't his thing and people were okay with it. And sometimes he would take ideas and change them, expand on them, etc., and use them for his own projects. He didn't get too involved because he was too busy on other stuff. Also worth noting that J.W. Rinzler had some minor work on a few Clone Wars episodes, so it's telling he attributes the series to George after having been behind the scenes of it. He also said in the same interview, George couldn't stand Mara Jade. They went out and got some sort of person who looked like she had stepped out of a Cosmopolitan magazine to be the model for Mara, and he just thought the whole thing was so not Star Wars and not his vision for Star Wars. And once again, I think Sue or Stoney between the novels told me they were killing off Mara Jade, and I said, do I get to tell George? And also she married Luke, and he says Jedis don't marry, so for him, that was important. Interesting. Obviously he attributes most of Lucas's disdain for Mara due to the model thing, but he brings up that according to Lucas, Jedi don't marry, and he clearly wasn't happy with how this played out in the EU. Our final quote I'm bringing up here comes from Lucy Autry Wilson, Director of Publishing at Lucasfilm, who said, our expanded universe, books, and comics were never intended to be canon. Only what George wrote was canon. We tried to keep an internal consistency so our writers did not contradict anything George had created or any of our other writers had added. She has no affiliation with Disney. She has no incentive to say this other than for sharing the truth. Only George's stuff was canon to him. Everything else was separate, and that was always the intent. It's also worth bringing up the Canon Tiers to further drive the point home. There are 6 Canon Tiers: G, T, C, S, N, and D. George, television, canon, I think that's what it's called, secondary, non-canon, and detours. The 6 films have been placed in G canon, while most EU content has been placed in C canon. If it was really all on the same level, then why is it not only one canon? If the goal was to provide a simpler answer for retcons, that's irrelevant because retcons happened anyway. And generally future stories or reference books would try to sort it out so that there was no retcons, so it could all have been on one tier. I think the answer is obvious. Lucas didn't count the EU as canon and would do whatever, so the canon tiers were made to eliminate confusion for consumers for when that would happen. Moving on, let's talk about the original trilogy. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them in the light.